She was one of the most recognisable, yet disgusting women of the Second World War. Magda Goebbels was a woman who became the best friend and closest confidant of the dictator of the Third Reich, and she was married to the Minister of Propaganda, who poisoned the minds of millions inside of Germany. Her cruelest and darkest action of the war came right at the end, as the Soviets encircled Berlin, and she remained inside of the underground complex known as the Führer bunker. For weeks she had plotted the murder of her own family, her 6 children, and she knew that this was the only way out for them. But within hours of doing this, she too would be dead, lying face down in the garden of the Reich Chancellery, her body littered with bullets. What happened next was chilling. Her body was covered in a small amount of fuel, and this was ignited, but things did not go too well with this. Magda Goebbels' corpse was charred, but not fully burned or incinerated, and days later it would be discovered and recognised. But in the days after, her body was placed in a coffin, and it was buried miles away in secret. But decades after the Second World War, Magda Goebbels' remains were exhumed, and her body was dug up again, once and for all. In this video we look at what happened and what was found that day, and what was discovered when her coffin was opened. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. In the early 1930s, Magda became fascinated by the rising Nazi Party. Nationalism, anti-communism, and admiration for Adolf Hitler's charisma drew her into the Nazi movement. It was during this time that she met Joseph Goebbels, a man of humble origins, who had risen to prominence as the party's master of propaganda. Goebbels was immediately captivated by Magda's beauty and sophistication, while Magda admired his intelligence and connections to Hitler. Their courtship was turbulent. Goebbels, a notorious womanizer, often clashed with Magda over his infidelity. Despite this, the couple married on December 19, 1931, in a high-profile ceremony, with Adolf Hitler acting as a witness. Hitler himself reportedly had a soft spot for Magda, seeing her as the perfect model of a Nazi woman, blonde, elegant, and devoted to the cause. Magda's marriage to Goebbels also cemented her position in the Nazi elite, making her one of the most powerful women in the Third Reich. As Hitler remained unmarried, Magda Goebbels assumed a public role that many regarded as akin to that of a First Lady. She was frequently photographed at official events, charming foreign dignitaries, and hosting gatherings at the Goebbels home. She became a symbol of the ideal German mother, giving birth to 6 children between 1932 and 1940: Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdin, Hedwig, and Heidrun. Their names, all starting with H, reflected her reverence for Hitler. Magda embraced the Nazi ideal of motherhood, and was often presented in propaganda as the perfect housewife and mother. Behind the scenes, however, her marriage to Goebbels was strained. Joseph's repeated affairs, most famously with the Czech actress Lida Barova, led to bitter fights, and even talks of divorce in 1938. Hitler personally intervened, forbidding the separation, because he believed that the Goebbels family represented an important image for the Nazi regime. Despite these personal conflicts, Magda remained fiercely loyal to Hitler and the Nazi cause. She admired Hitler, almost to the point of worship, seeing him as a messianic figure destined to reshape Germany and Europe. But there are allegations that in private, Magda Goebbels did go against Hitler and refer to his speeches as nonsense at times. But her husband's devotion to the Führer led them to take up position inside of the Führer bunker as the war turned completely against the Germans. Inside the city of Berlin, of which her husband was a Gauleiter or local leader, the Goebbels family lived in the upper part of Hitler's bunker, known as the Ruhrbunker. They remained utterly devoted to the Nazi cause at that time, and they knew that there would be only one way out. Magda wrote a farewell letter to her eldest son, and in this she outlined what she would do. She claimed, "Our glorious idea is ruined, and with it everything beautiful and marvellous that I have known in my life. The world that comes after the Führer and National Socialism is not any longer worth living in, and therefore I took the children with me, for they are too good for the life that would follow, and a merciful God will understand me when I will give them their salvation. The children are wonderful. There never is a word of complaint nor crying. The impacts are shaking the bunker. The eldest kids cover the younger ones. Their presence is a blessing, and they are making the Führer smile once in a while. May God help that I have the strength to perform the last and hardest. We only have one goal left, loyalty to the Führer, even in death. So days before she even knew she would murder her own children. Goebbels was actually ordered to leave Berlin in Hitler's last will and testament, but he refused to do this, disobeying Hitler's final order. Magda had also refused numerous attempts to actually save her children and have them evacuated out of Berlin. She was one of the last people to see Eva Braun and Hitler before they disappeared inside of the study. On the 1st of May 1945, Magda and Joseph had arranged for SS dentist Helmut Kunz to inject their 6 children with morphine, making them unconscious. Magda then crushed an ampule of cyanide in their mouths, killing them. After she had killed her children, she and her husband walked into the garden of the Reich Chancellery, up the stairs of the fire exit. There are differing accounts as to what happened next. One states that the pair bit down on a cyanide capsule in the garden, and then an SS adjutant wandered over and gave them a coup de grace gunshot to the head, finishing them off. Another account is that Goebbels shot himself and Magda consumed cyanide, and then the bodies were littered with gunshots and bullets, and the bodies did not move. Another possible story is that Joseph shot Magda and then turned the pistol on himself. We will never know what happened in those final moments, but the bodies were then doused with limited amounts of petrol and were set on fire. There wasn't enough fuel inside of Berlin, as most had been used the previous day to burn the corpses of Hitler and Eva Braun. Now, it wasn't long before the charred bodies were discovered. In fact, the next day, on the 2nd of May 1945, the Soviet Red Army came across the bodies inside the Reich Chancellery Garden. The body of Joseph Goebbels was heavily scorched, but was recognisable shockingly, and even his orthopaedic device for his shortened leg was found in relatively good condition. But Magda's body was described as scorched beyond recognition. Her face had burned better than the rest of her body. Presumably the SS adjutants poured most of the fuel over her face first. But found with the body were a couple of possessions. Firstly, there was a cigarette case inscribed with Adolf Hitler 29X34 on it, which Magda had used in the last 3 weeks of her life. Also, she had on her Hitler's Golden Party badge, which he had given to Magda 3 days before his death. Also found on her charred remains was a reddish-blonde hairpiece, which she wore, and her dental remains, including the maxilla and mandible, were found loose on her corpse, along with splinters and fragments of a glass ampule, presumably from the cyanide. Now, the Soviets then reunited the remains of the Goebbelses with their children, and they were photographed before being packed away inside of coffins. The coffins were taken under the cover of nightfall to Buch, a suburb of Berlin, where they were forensically analysed. Autopsies took place on not just the Goebbels' remains, but also actually the remains of Hitler and Eva Braun, which were discovered days later. After this, the remains were then buried in a number of secret locations by the Soviets to prevent them becoming a shrine for the Nazis, but also to prevent them falling into the hands of the Allies. The Soviets saw the bodies as huge trophies for them. They were moved on to Rafnar before being taken to a Smersh facility in Magdeburg. The bodies of the Goebbels family in their coffins were buried in secret under wasteland within the facility, and no one could get access to this. The coffin of Magda Goebbels lay there for around 25 years, unknown. Most presume that the bodies had been dealt with once and for all, but in 1970, the Soviet Secret Service, the KGB, feared this secret may be discovered, as the land was about to be handed over to the East Germans. The remains of Hitler allegedly were also buried there, and the KGB decided to destroy the remains once and for all. On the 4th of April 1970, a KGB team led by Yuri Andropov exhumed the remains from the Magdeburg facility of the Goebbels family and the others. They were taken out of their grave, and the coffins, presuming they were intact, were removed under the cover of nightfall and were taken to a Soviet military base where the bodies were cremated once and for all. The body of Magda Goebbels was incinerated, and the ashes were then scattered in the Biederitz River. With the scattering of her ashes in the river, Magda Goebbels' body was effectively erased from history. Unlike other Nazi leaders who were tried at Nuremberg and buried in marked graves or cremated with official records, Magda's final resting place was intentionally obliterated by Soviet authorities. The handling of Magda Goebbels' body reflects the intense secrecy and propaganda war between the Soviets and Western allies during the early Cold War. In death as in life, Magda Goebbels remained tied to the fate of the Third Reich. The deliberate destruction of her remains was part of a larger Soviet operation to ensure that neither she, her husband, nor Hitler could become martyrs or focal points for future extremist movements. Today, the only surviving evidence of her remains are Soviet autopsy documents and dental charts, an unceremonious end for a woman who once stood at the very heart of Nazi power. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.